introduce yourself to the wonderful people and, what you do at Onyx.
Okay, yes. Hello, everybody. I'm Chris Allen. I am a freelance writer and developer for tabletop games and a bit of miniatures games work. So what I do at Onyx Path is, again, I'm a freelancer. So Onyx Path contracts me for specific projects rather than being sort of a permanent staff member. And what that means is on a given book, I'll either be asked to write or develop for it. Writing is very straightforward in terms of what that involves. Developing is a much more in-depth role for bringing a project to light. It varies exactly depending on what the project is and who the source is and who sort of outlined it and come up with the idea. But the developer is responsible for managing every stage of the book, making sure it hits deadlines, making sure it comes through in a form that is matching what is desired, that what you get out the other end is the book you've asked for in the first place. Handling things like art, asking for art notes and things like that. While I don't do the art direction, I do put the art notes through to the art director to then contract out to artists, and then reviewing when the book reaches the form of being laid out. It's then reviewing it at that stage and making sure that everything's, the I's are dotted, T's are crossed, and everything is as it should be. So in the case of Victorian Mage, I was one of the developers on the book. There was a certain amount of turnover on the project. Obviously, Victorian Mage has had quite a lengthy, storied history getting it to this point. So I was brought on both from a point of view of someone with historical knowledge who could really give that good overview of the book and make sure it all made sense in that respect, and also from the logistics and admin side of getting it finished, finalized, and done. But I worked extensively with Ian Watson as well, who did a lot of the deep mage lore on the book and made sure that was all up to scratch.
All right, very cool. Okay, so now I gotta ask. So, for those who don't know, what is Mage the Ascension? Because all I've seen is the meme with the book being this big or this big, and every time I see it, I swear the book gets bigger.
Well, what is Mage Ascension? I mean, there's a couple of angles to it. The first is it's a game about magic. It's a game about power in the hands of mages who perceive the world in certain ways through their paradigm and attempt to work their will on it. So it's about, in some ways, it's about the struggle for power over reality. Like many World of Darkness games, there's a lot of different layers you can play the game at. Everything from street mages all the way up to, grand archmages battling for the fate of reality itself. Another way, of course, to look at it is that it's a World of Darkness game. There is a horror element to it. A lot of stuff when people talk about mage, they talk about some of the really sort of out there elements, like mages traveling to the far moons on spacecraft and otherworldly sanctums where they're taking place grand politics and conflicts. But it is a horror game as well. It's a game where you are giving you're saying there's a bunch of people with incredible power. What are they doing with it? And well, they're not always making what we consider good choices for what to do with that power and the pursuit of that power as well. So it's urban magic, it's urban occult, almost fantasy. It's also modern horror of its own brand.
Very cool. Okay, so now I gotta ask. I hear that I've seen Mage. It's the modern mages. We have all that. So what is new though in the Victorian Mage that you're producing right now?
Yeah, so it's odd because it's what's new in it is almost what's old. We've had to we've rolled back from what the current situation is in modern day Mage to see, okay, well, how did they get there? What laid the foundations for the world as it is today in Mage? In Mage you have this struggle, the Ascension War. You have this conflict between the traditions on one hand and the technocracy on the other hand. The traditions representing a lot of forms of magic practice around the world, and the technocracy notably, as the name indicating, being a kind of scientific magic, technomantic angle on things. And by the modern day, of course, the technocracy I'm not going to say they've won out, but there is the consensus, the paradigm of reality is very much conforming to what the technocracy wants it to be, with machinery and science and so forth all being major parts of everyone's daily lives. In Victorian Mage, that's not yet the case. So the two interleaving sort of layers of what's going on in Victorian Mage is, firstly, you've got the world, as we know, the Victorian era. We're not just looking at Victorian Britain. We're not even just looking at the British Empire. We're looking at the whole world. But it is a time of massive change. the forces of imperialism, pushing across the globe, causing massive destruction and tumult as they go. It is not a nice or happy time, despite how many people now like to imagine it as being. For every rich person in a top hat and a monocle and a nice waistcoat going, "Oh, what a lovely time it is here in London," you've got enormous numbers of people who suffered to make that happen. The flip side of that is that the forerunners of the technocracy, the Order of Reason, have hitched their wagon to the spread of imperialism, and they're using that to spread their magical paradigm. But at this point in the world, magic operates on different rules all over the place, depending on local beliefs, local cultures. And what Victorian Mage is about then is about the advance of the Order of Reason as they attempt to flip the world essentially to match their beliefs, their paradigm, and they have a great willingness for everyone else to make any number of sacrifices to make that happen. And they're up against, while the Ascension War is very much there, the division between the tradition and the technocracy is there. Well, the technocracy is the Order of Reason. It's a real mess in the era. The traditions, the traditional player character groups, although you can play the technocracy and Order of Reason, are in a mess. They're fighting infighting all over the place. There should be 9 of them. There's only 8. They themselves, some of them, are hitching their wagon to imperialism and benefiting from all the extraction of magical resources from around the world to them. Others are going, "This is a terrible plan. What the hell are you doing?" So it's what's different really is that there is this massive wave of change sweeping through the setting, but it hasn't yet hit the point in the modern day where the technocracy as will be have sort of made their mark. Everything is in flux. Everything is changing. The world is not yet mapped by those who are going out to explore it. So yeah, it's a lot of opportunities, and as I said before, it's a game of horror. There's a lot of awful stuff as well. And it's about seeing what happens when you give all these mages with all this power the chance to start meddling with this kind of mass global change taking place.
Okay, I got it. All right. So what I'm hearing basically is like we're battling over this immediate change that's about to happen, or we're right on the edge, but it's not quite tipped over.
Yeah, I mean, the book actually covers a whole chunk. It covers the Victorian era, so the 1830s to the very end of the 1800s, very beginning of the 1900s. This is a bit of a challenge in how you present that in the book, because we can't do a full 70-year timeline for everything in the book. So while some parts it delves into that, like the fact the Order of Reason, this big group of technomancers, we go into their timeline a bit and how they change. And some of the areas into the Gazetteer, we talk a bit about how it changes throughout the era. But some places we've had to take a sort of a snapshot of maybe the most interesting period in that, whether, as you say, on the cusp of changing, it's not quite there, or maybe when it's all kicking off and everything is changing and the people are scrabbling to adapt to that or deal with it or stop it.
Okay. So that kind of leads me to my next question. What inspired specifically the Victorian setting? Is it just this change, or is it that you guys just really like the Victorian setting? What Victorian?
So why Victorian Mage? So a lot of those decisions were made well before I joined the product. As I said, Victorian Mage has been in the works quite a while. And specifically, it has a predecessor, I suppose, thematically, which is the Victorian Vampire. I believe it was a Victorian Vampire the Masquerade was a very popular supplement. So, as ever, the Victorian era is a very popular one at the moment for people to delve into anyway. Mage has a number of themes that kind of match the Victorian era very well, both in terms of power and some of the aesthetics as well. There's been a long-running thing with the sort of steampunk feel of some Mage's factions. And while Victorian Mage is not a steampunk game, it's not like, oh, shove some cogs on it, isn't it all wonderful? That thematic link is definitely there. So I think to one extent, to one hand, you have people looking at Victorian Vampire and going, well, Victorian Mage seems like a great sort of follow-on to that. It was eventually slated as a follow-on from the Mage 20th anniversary Kickstarter, I believe, is where it sort of the project started, but I think it had been being thought of and in the works for a while. And I think a lot of it really is that the era matches the themes very well. The other thing is the various World of Darkness games have had historical supplements. There was Sorcerer's Crusade. There's Mage, earlier incarnations of Mage. The Victorian era is one of the ones that hadn't yet been covered, but is this pivotal era for one of the major groups, the Technocracy, when they become the Technocracy. And people have always been really keen to see how that happens, essentially, because it gets referenced in the later books, and these tantalizing little tidbits like Queen Victoria's involvement and such like that, and people looking at going, what the hell, what actually happened, so the chance to fill that gap, I think, is quite appealing as well.
Okay, all right. So yeah, I can see why a lot of people are excited about that. So my next question is, what is your specifically favorite part of developing the Victorian Mage?
Yeah, well, there's one thing I'll say that is my favorite with anything I've developed or written. It's a bit shallow, really, but it's whenever I get to see the artwork coming in for stuff I've worked on. I always really love that. It's not a Victorian specific one, but there's always that moment where the artists start to send in, produce their stuff, and I get to see it, and I go, wow, that's really nailed this thing that I've written, or whether it's because they've actually absolutely got the directions I've given them for a specific piece of art as a developer, or if it's because I'm a writer who's written a thing, not expecting anything to come of it, and then you see some cool artwork of the thing you wrote. That's always really satisfying. Partly because I have no visual artistic talent whatsoever of my own, so seeing other people take it and run with it is always really pleasing. With Victorian Mage, I suppose the really interesting part for me as a developer was seeing how some of the writers took the game concepts of Mage, the playability of it, and then meshed it with real life history in interesting ways. Because obviously, what we don't want is a sort of dry history textbook saying this is the Victorian era. We want a book that you pick up and you go, okay, it's got loads of ideas for how to play Mage in this era. It's about mages in this era. It's not just regular history with some mages sort of bolted on top. So seeing how some of the writers in the Gazetteer section in particular sort of brought those together in terms of bringing out what the mage factions are up to in the various parts of the world, and seeing as well some of the more rules-centered stuff around how magic works and the adaptations there, both in the mechanics but also some of the lingo, the wording, the changes in wording as to how mages refer to stuff in the era and that kind of thing. So that's what I've really enjoyed, is seeing the merging of Mage with the era at that kind of level.
Okay. I see. So you have you have mages, and you have some I don't want to say old-timey speak, but the lingo changes over time. That's interesting that you put that in the book. That's really cool.
Yeah.
All right.
Well, one of the things, just as an example, one of the things is that when mages screw up their magic, you get the thing that's involved is called paradox. Yeah. And the era is, so there's a different word in Victorian Mage for paradox, just because of the shift in linguistics and things. Now, obviously, not every mage across the whole world is going to call it whatever anyway. They're going to use their own words and their own languages. But having that in there's some changes that I think helps give the book itself that slightly different feel and helps immerse you a bit more as a reader in what's going on. So I'm quite keen on that kind of era-specific adjustment.
Very cool. And I know that you have a history background regarding Victorian Age. So what kind of what did you have to pull from history, you specifically? And you were like, hey guys, check this out.
Yeah. So the nice thing is I didn't have to do too much of that myself. Also, I apologize if for the background there's a small child having a meltdown. Hopefully that's not coming through the comms, but I am where it might be.
Just a little bit.
Yeah, okay. So I didn't have to do too much on that front because a lot of that is in the writer's hands, ideally, anyway. And the ideal is, you give the writers their directions of what to look into. They go away, they do the research, they do the writing, and come back, and you can then check it and make sure it makes sense. But you don't have to necessarily do that much additional work. And in general, that was the case with this book. So there's a lot of interesting stuff in there. So the really interesting stuff for me is not the history I did, because I didn't have to do that much, thankfully, but some of the things that the writers pulled out, like the evolution of warfare in Europe at this time. We see the beginning of some really odd stuff, which will build into ultimately, technological progression that we would see in the 1900s. We see the very beginnings of the idea of air power, with people trying to get bombs on air, on hot air balloons and things. And then some of the writers have nicely tied stuff into that with the mages' attempts to change the paradigms that reality are running on, to change what people believe is possible. So lots of little tidbits like that coming through. The other thing that we were really keen on in terms of the history side of it, and obviously then reinforcing with the game and the magic, but really as the underlay, is that obviously due to imperialism, a lot of the histories out of the era, the direct histories, pitch things in a certain way, they pitch things in a certain light. And while that has had a heavy influence on the history that follows, the sources are there to read it in a different way and understand what's going on. Particularly, what we're keen on is the perspectives of the people who were on the other end of the boot when it came to imperialism spreading, when it came to empires conquering and advancing. We wanted to make sure that the book really shows everybody as people in their own right with their own agency. Yes, as the era panned out, things went very badly for loads of them, but it wasn't that they were haplessly doomed to this from the start. People resisted the advance of empire, they fought back, they adapted to it, and there's a lot of complexity to what went on, but that ultimately it's not just a story of Britain sitting at the center of a massive empire breaking in all the wealth, and that's what the story is just about, that beating heart. It's about people on the fringes of empire, it's people beyond the fringes of empire, all these places that people would say, oh, we explored and we mapped, but of course people already lived there. So what was their perspective on this, and then folding that into a game about magic as well, and about their traditions and practices and how they respond to all that.
That is excellent, because I'm a very avid steampunk and fan, so I see a lot of like Victorian Age in England, and I'm like, yeah, that's cool, but to get like perspective of other people who maybe weren't so jazzed about imperialism and
Oh
colonialism,
yeah, absolutely.
You get an interesting perspective, and you start to really flesh out, I think, the worlds. That's really nice that you threw that in there. That's great. I do have another question, though. Not so fun. What was your greatest struggle working on this?
So the biggest struggle on this was probably logistics to an extent, because this is a project that's been going on for quite a while, and there'd been some turnover in staff on it. And what that meant in practice is that, say, people who have said, yes, I can totally do this, quite a long time ago in the process, and then you get back to them again and now they can't because it's taken time. So one of the struggles for me when I came on was just was that of a turnover, was sort of reassembling the core team for making everything happen, because people weren't able to always maintain commitments over that time period. So that was a bit of a struggle. Any book has a lot of moving parts. You have all the different writers, you have the developers, you have people above you in the company who have approved of things. You need to make sure it all matches what is supposed to be happening. It's a licensed game, so obviously it's come through. Onyx Path are doing this on the license given to them by White Wolf Paradox. So there's always that element of trying to make sure that everything's woven together correctly. And because of the time scale, that some of those bits got a bit stressed. And so I'd sort of weave that back together to get us sort of out the door and get the project finished and pushed over the final line. So it's not very exciting stuff, but just sometimes, the admin and logistics is what can be difficult from a development point of view. For a slightly more interesting answer, I guess, one of my things about this, having just talked about imperialism, was wanting a game that takes a more sensitive look at the era, that doesn't fall back into tropes, particularly racist tropes about areas of the world. And that's not, well, I'm not going to say it's hard per se, because we made this very clear on the project for everyone going in what we were aiming for. It's quite tiring to be reviewing text a lot and being very on the lookout for stuff, not just assuming it's going to be fine, but actively trying to make sure that you are making the best project you can in that respect. So a bit stressful doing that, but I hope that the end result is good in that respect, and that what we've given is a sensitive but also interesting view of the world, that's hopefully highly playable in Mage games as well.
I mean, it sounds fantastic, and I totally understand where you're coming from. All the moving parts. I mean, we're working on V2 right now in the finishing stages, and man, there's been times in which I'm talking to the art director and I'm talking to the content director, and then I go over and I talk to Ryan, and we're all like, wait, let's just have a Zoom meeting because all of us are doing so many separate things. We just gotta chill out and come together. So
Yeah, and sometimes disasters happen. You have a writer whose laptop explodes, or they flooded out their home, or a literal natural disaster has hit the area they live in, or they're having health issues, and that's the kind of thing you just have to make allowances for, because you can't. There's no way to avoid it when you have a big team of people working on something. Stuff is going to happen, and the best way to do that, some people found that maybe they'd taken on something they thought they could handle and they couldn't, and the best way to deal with it is to be understanding and facilitate what they need to get it done, or to move a step away and get someone else in to do it, because otherwise you will go mad trying to sort of keep everything together. So it's best to sort of work with the people as they have problems and be understanding of those, I think.
I got a final question here. This one's specifically for my boss Ryan. He is obsessed with Mage. So any sneak previews or sneak peeks we can get into the content of Mage?
Okay, so I believe today they're doing manuscript previews of the first 4 chapters. So let me just have a quick look on my list as to what those 4 chapters will be. One thing for me is this has been a project going on over many years, and some of the details have slipped my mind because it's been some time since I handed off the manuscript for different things. So I believe we're seeing the Society of Shadow chapter and the Tradition, Order of Reason and Crafts chapters coming out today, all of which are packed full of stuff. The crafts chapter is quite an interesting one because the crafts are basically smaller independent groups of mages who don't belong to the traditions or the Order of Reason, and they're really important at this time of the in this period, especially because there's a feeling that maybe one of them might rise up to be a major new power block. In particular, there's one thing of interest there. Some people, the technomancer groups, the independent technomancers, like the Zulu mechanists. But what else we got? We've got so after that we're going to have some more chapters. We've got chapters about making characters in the Victorian era. So that's really about the kind of changes you'd expect to see for character generation, taking into account some skills, some advantages, backgrounds, things are not going to work the same way, or maybe not work at all. We've got one of the big ones is the chapter on magic, which, as I said, this is an era where everything is the reality zones from Mage. Everything is territories of magic. The rules of what is rather than sort of vulgar and subtle and covert is unelegant, uncanny, and catastrophic are the different terms for the sort of how much can you get away with your magic, and the rules for what falls into each of those changes depending on where local cultures and such like, or how far empire has gone. And there's rules, there's shifted rules, things like paradox and stuff in there. We've got the other thing we've got is the big gazetteer chapter, which looks at how everything spreads across, how everything's happening across the world, and how the empire spreads. And that is a full world overview. Obviously, some areas have sort of more. We've had to pick out highlights and things rather than doing a completely exhaustive view of stuff. Africa, we've got loads of interesting stuff in the African section, but Africa is a huge place full of many different countries. We couldn't sort of get them all to a level of an interesting level of write-up. So some areas are focused on specific bits. Same true of Europe. We don't look at the whole of Europe. We look at some of the more key things going on at the time. We've got the storytelling antagonist chapter. So the antagonist chapter is, I say antagonist chapter. It's a chapter write-up of sample characters from common people on the street you might meet, all the way up to really, really horrible sorts. You've got your vampires hiding among the ranks of the aristocracy, your marauder mages perpetrating atrocities across the world under the cover of whatever cover they can get, we have also, as I said, the storytelling chapter has some stuff in there, some suggestions for maybe variant ways of playing, not just rules for things like, you're playing a Wild West game, maybe think about some extra rules for the showdown kind of feel, but also stuff like letters. I can't remember what the word is, but playing a game with a lot of letter writing in it, in terms of maybe as downtime between sessions, having the characters writing letters that have game effect, but are also a way of expressing what the characters are going through as they send us. Because this is the epistolary. That's the word. The epistolary chronicle. This is an era where that kind of letter writing is a big deal. So maybe ways to bring things like that forward in games. Ways to do stuff with ways to build a gothic. Have your villain be a gothic villain in terms of feeling. With some of the literary archetypes and tropes around how they're portrayed in novels and the like of the era. So yeah, it's such a big book with so much different stuff in it that giving a sort of sneak preview is quite hard because it's almost too specific. I could tell you, for example, that in the world write-up, we've got a section where the Suez Canal, this very much a flashpoint of imperialist power in Egypt, is all and industry and commerce is also the site of mages playing silly buggers with the because the canal isn't wide, it has issues with the width of the ships coming down towards each other, has to be carefully timed. So there are young Order of Reason luminaries put in charge who are just playing games, mucking about with it, placing bets on whether ships will get through before they hit one another and things like that. But that's sort of a tiny bit of detail, but there are loads of bits of detail like that throughout it, so pulling any one bit out is almost quite hard, because it isn't Victorian Mage with the one shtick being this one thing, like wizards and waistcoats. It's a take on the whole world and the massive changes going on across the board, and there are so many of them that it's really difficult to pick out one change, one bit of detail, one rule, as it were.
I totally get that. I can see that it's a big project. I love wizards and waistcoats. I love that phrase. I'm gonna embroider that. But that's very interesting. I love that you've built this expansive world at this magnified time and space, and you're allowing your audience to be able to see that and interact with that and build from that. And I heard something about cowboy wizards, and I think that's the best thing I've ever heard today.
Yes, you can be a cowboy wizard. I believe the artwork for one of the traditions is precisely that. So there's two like that. For instance, there's two elements to that. There's sort of three really. You've got the traditions who are involved in what's going on in America. With the changes going on there, especially scientific and the Order of Reason getting dug in there. You've got the sort of the specifics of the changes in America sort of going the other way with stuff on the ground level. Things like what happens when you stick a mage in the Wild West. We tell you what's going on there in general, but you can then sort of use that as the backdrop to see for yourself sort of what happens there. Maybe detached from the bigger picture as well. You could play whoever you want in that situation. And then you've got, say, the little bit of rules in the storytelling chapter going, do you want to have your high noon-esque simplified system for doing your high noon-esque duels, which you can do with revolvers, or you can potentially do with magic or the like as well. So any slice you take, there's a few different angles you can approach it at, both the big picture of what the big factions are doing, there's a little the small localized picture of what's going on the ground for people there, and any mage could be in that situation. And then the take of, okay, but how do we make this maybe feel a bit more generally Victorian in terms of aesthetic or tone, with changes to the rules as well.
That's great. Awesome. Okay, so we're coming up on the time. Is there anything else you want to deliver into the world before we close out?
No, not really. I mean, I think we've had a pretty exhaustive chat about the book itself. It's doing quite well on Indiegogo at the moment, so we're hitting various stretch goals.
It's fully funded, right?
Yeah, it's gone past fully funded. It's hit several stretch goals already. Indiegogo has been a bit of an experiment for Onyx Path on this one, but it seems to be working out. We're very pleased to hear both people's feedback about Indiegogo versus Kickstarter or other platforms, but also it's definitely gratifying to see the book doing well. So I look forward to people's reactions as more of it is revealed. I am entirely unapologetic now. I did see at least one Mage fan saying, "Oh, the book is going to be a lot about how bad imperialism is." Well, I mean, I'm entirely unapologetic about that. The book is very clear about how bad imperialism was for huge numbers of people, and I think that's a stronger viewpoint to take than sort of ignoring it and trying to just make this a sanitized gaming setting where it's all lovely, and nice. It's a horror setting in many ways, and it has to address a lot of those issues. So. But beyond that, I think I haven't got anything else to throw out there.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining me, and I'm sure in the description of this video on YouTube, as well as linked on all our socials, we'll drop again the link to the Victorian Mage. We did that a while ago, but we'll do it again to make sure everybody can access it and still back it and be able to, help, not just help fund the project, it's already funded, but be a part of it and participate in it.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
thank you so
absolutely.
much for joining me.
Thank you very much for having me.